Welcome to the Bradford Cloud User Group, another virtual event. I believe it's the 14th one now. And we have another amazing guest this month. It is Johan Myburgh. I can now pronounce that properly. He's a colleague, he's a friend, and he's taken out time to come and talk to us all about how to deploy a static web app in Azure with some cool demos. I think it's about an hour session. Hopefully we'll have some decent discussions as well. If you do have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. If you don't want to unmute yourself, drop it in the chat and myself and Saj will pick up and maybe at the right time, maybe disturb Johan and say, throw a question in for you. So yeah, open to discussions. We're all here to learn, share knowledge. If you are not going to ask a question, please do go on mute. And I'm going to hand over to Johan, who's going to introduce himself and then kick off the session for tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure where everyone is, to be fair. Probably somewhere scattered around the UK, but let me just quickly share my screen here. My name is Johan Myburgh. I'm an Azure technical trainer or a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. I've been in this role now for about probably about 2.5 years, but prior to that, I was a cloud solution architect in South Africa. I've only been in the UK since January, so it's all relatively new to me. Figuring out, what the different colored bins mean outside my house, these sort of things. It's, roundabouts, all stuff that I was never concerned about. But as Imran mentioned, I work with him. We're on the same team, yeah, I'm here to talk to you today about static web applications, right? So I'm not going to waffle on too much about myself here. I honestly, between you and me, I have no idea how long the session is going to take. This is the first time I actually do this session with all the content I'm chatting about today. So it might be under an hour, it might go a little bit over. I'm not 100% sure, but please, if I'm going too long, throw me with something soft. And I will kind of cut it short. Okay, so now I've got a bit of an agenda going here. I'm not going to spend too much time in slides, but I think it's important that we understand what we are talking about here. So just in brief, we're going to chat about what static web apps are. What's the difference between a static web application and a normal web application, as we might be familiar with them, like a PHP or an ASP.NET application. What are the differences exactly? Then we will talk about ASP.NET Blazor, right? And if you haven't heard of ASP.NET Blazor, it's a really interesting framework that Microsoft has built. It's part of the ASP.NET stack, and it's a part of the .NET Core, so it runs on both Windows as well as Linux. But the key here is actually that with ASP.NET Blazor, you've got two deployment models, and we'll talk about those two deployment models. And then we're not gonna get straight into static web apps, because as you might know, static web apps is actually a type of service we get in Azure, right? So I'll end off with that. That's probably the cool part. But we will start with looking at storage accounts, which is kind of the quick and dirty, cheaper option to do these things. We will also chat a little bit about Azure App Services. I won't go into details there. Imran will probably start rolling his eyes at this point in time because he's watched me do Azure App Services over and over. And then we will talk about static web apps, right? And what the benefits are of using static web apps. I've got some summaries in terms of costing and these sort of things. And then if you don't have any questions during the session, you don't want to sort of unmute and ask me questions, I will leave some time for questions at the end, if it's all the same to you. However, as Imran mentioned, I would prefer if you actually sort of unmuted and ask me questions during the session. I really don't mind that. So please go ahead and do that if you want to do that. Okay, so let's get cooking. First of all, what are static web apps? And I'm going to come back to the slide, if you don't mind. I'm going to first just quickly pop us onto this whiteboard of mine. I'm definitely not known for whiteboarding. I'm not a Picasso. I write and I draw terribly, but I should at least be able to get the point over here. So let's talk and think a little bit about your traditional sort of web application. We used to usually have something like a browser-based interface. I hope everyone can see my screen and hear me properly. Typically had a browser, right? Maybe something like Edge, whatever the case might be, some sort of a browser-based interface. And the browser typically connected to a web server, right? Some other web server. This might be something like Apache. It might be IIS. It could be, Nginx, whatever that might be. But traditionally, these applications also had some sort of a data source in the background, right? So maybe something like a SQL server. Maybe it was a NoSQL environment like a standard DB where you've got like NoSQL key value pair type lookups. And the reality is how this actually worked is the browser sent a request over to the web server for a specific page, typically. This page was maybe something like an ASP.NET page or a PHP page, Java server pages, whatever the case might be. And there was some execution that happened on the web server, right? And in turn, this code would run, connect to the database, return the values from the database, build up some HTML, right? Embed, and kind of loop through the data, churn out a string of HTML, maybe in a table, and return that table to the browser, right? And the browser would render this information. Okay, this is you could probably see this as a type of a three-tiered application because we've got the data tier, we've got the web server and business logic type tier, and then we've got the browser tier, which is traditionally not really a full tier if you want to think about it like that. But we also use things like JavaScript and dynamic HTML, right, to manipulate the information inside the browser. Maybe when the user hovers over something, you pop a dialog and you show some additional information. Maybe the table doesn't render all the data by default, and you have to click on something to show the data, maybe like a master detail type view. So this essentially created a three-tiered application. And in some cases, it was even a little bit more complex where you might have the web server and another app server in between, right? I'm not going to draw that in there now, but it could become quite, if you think of applications like SharePoint, for example, right? SharePoint will have, 5 or 6 different roles that eventually push out the HTML back to the browser. Maybe one role for search, maybe one role for, whatever it might be. Okay, so this is how things actually used to work. With the onset of single-page web-based applications or static web apps, the model has actually changed quite significantly, right? So we still have our database, and we still have our web server, and we still have the browser. Draw the browser in here, right? So we still have all these components. That's the web server, and that is the database server. But with static web applications, the web server doesn't return HTML, it just returns data. So actually what happens is the HTML that renders in the browser, all that HTML and CSS and JavaScript renders in the browser, and the browser now makes the HTTP request to the web server that doesn't return HTML. It returns the raw data in the form of maybe something like JSON data. It might be something a little bit more binary. And the browser actually renders this information and does the bulk of the execution. So in other words, there's no execution that happens on the web server anymore. The web server sends out the HTML, and the browser then makes a request, right? So this lends itself more towards a microservices type architecture. So you might have a whole bunch of different operations on the web server. The web server now acts as a type of an API and interface for the database server, and the browser actually does all the work. This has got several implications, right? First of all, if you're running this on a platform like on Azure, it implies that you don't have to run your web application on a platform that requires compute capability. So for example, I don't need application services or a web server with the .NET framework installed or anything like that. Effectively, all I need is I just need something that streams out the HTML. And then for the data services, you do need some execution. But we'll get to the static web apps a bit later, which is a relatively new service inside of Azure that rolls everything into one. And you'll see what I'm getting to there. Okay. So the key difference here is the business logic might actually now be contained in the HTML in the browser. And when I click on a link, it doesn't submit a request to a page on the web server and come back with a new page. It makes a JavaScript call, like a web services call to the data. The web server responds with the data from the database, and the browser rebuilds the page dynamically without reloading the entire page. Does that make sense for everyone? Any questions? I'm going to ask if there are questions so that I can move on if anyone is unclear about this. So please, if there are questions, let me know. So if I can pop back onto the slide here, you'll see that what I've got here is I've got the HTML on the left-hand side in the browser, and on the right-hand side, I've got some microservices that are providing the data, right? So this is probably seen as a microservices architecture where my get price operation, if you like, is completely independent from the get stock quantity and the get colors type operation. I can just call get price with maybe something like a stock code, and it'll bring back the price, and this allows me to show the price in the browser. So I don't require anything relating to compute on the web server side, right? And what we might end up doing is we might end up using something like Azure Functions, because Azure Functions provide a great way of wrapping your business logic with a microservices architecture that actually allows you to connect to a database, return the data, and spit back the raw data to the browser, which knows how to actually format that information into HTML that renders in the browser. So if we take a step back here and say, what are static web apps? It's really HTML, right? It is that HTML file on your desktop that you can double click on, and it renders the page without you needing a web server to run. Everything runs typically in the browser. There's no server-side compute required, right? Unless you've got the services, but we'll get to that. And it looks a little and smells a little bit more like a two-tiered application, right? Where the JavaScript is calling microservices and returning some of that data. Okay, so that's what a static web app is. And if you look at over the last couple of years, different frameworks, and I've got that. I don't have that in the slide here, but I did put a couple of them, on the first page. If you think of things like Vue, Angular, JavaScript frameworks. Let me just pop in here. JavaScript frameworks that actually allow me to call using a REST-based call to those web services and return that data and format that data in a way that's kind of renderable and rendered by the browser. Okay. Now there is one here that you might actually not recognize if you're new to this. It's called Blazor. So Blazor is an interesting one because with Blazor, what Microsoft have done is they've taken and as I mentioned, with your standard static web app, if you're using something like Angular, you're talking about HTML and JavaScript, right? Some CSS mixed in between, and a couple of additional sort of my HTML5, whatever the case might be. But with Blazor, what Microsoft have done is we've given you two types of frameworks to work with, right? I can still run the traditional sort of web application where, as you can see there, I've got a web server and I've got my browser on the right-hand side, and the browser is rendering HTML, making calls back to the web server, returning data, rendering that data, standard browser type scenario. But we've also got what's known as the WebAssembly, right? And WebAssembly is the interesting one because you'll see here, what we've actually done is we've taken the .NET framework and we built the .NET framework into the browser. Okay, so now as opposed to rendering HTML to the browser, we allow you to download the entire .NET application into the browser, right? So the browser executes .NET code, and that .NET code allows you to make calls to a backend service and return some of that data. So it's a bit of a different model. It's almost like a combination of .NET and static HTML rolled into one, and that allows the Blazor components to interact with the document object model, which is essentially your HTML tree, and vice versa, right? So the HTML can interact with the .NET code, the .NET code can interact with the document object model. I'm going to quickly show you how to create one of these. It's actually relatively simple. I'm going to crack open code here. There's our trusty Visual Studio Code. So if you just give me a second, should have had that on the right screen here. And I'm going to go with open a folder, and let's go for my repos. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this one this static, because I'm probably running low on names to use. That is the story of my life at this point in time. There you go. I've got this folder now. The folder is completely empty, as you can see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say .NET new Blazor wasm. All right, that won't be in the exam later on this evening. I'm going to just hit the enter button here. I can also create a standard Blazor-based application that will require the web server and send the HTML back. But in this instance, I'm going for new .NET Blazor wasm, which is a WebAssembly. This is the component that I spoke about that actually downloads the .NET framework into the browser, and the browser executes the .NET code, right? It even works on a mobile device. It's pretty nifty. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do a .NET build. It's happy puppy, and then I'm going to do a .NET run. Let's do a .NET what run. So there we go. There's hello world. There's counter. So I can go, this is just a vanilla application. There's nothing fancy about this. You'll see there's a weather forecast, right? The weather forecast is, and you'll see later on when we start talking about the static web applications for Blazor, for Azure specifically, you will see that we will start returning this data from an Azure function, right? So we'll slowly sort of move into that sort of direction. Okay, but what I've got here is I've got the application, and what you might notice is if I go and view the page source, you'll notice that it's actually not showing me anything here. Why? Because it's just giving me a HTML page, and the HTML page is spinning up the .NET code in my browser, right? So the browser essentially hosts the .NET code, very similar to what the web server used to actually host the web application that returned the HTML, right? And then the .NET code in my browser splits the HTML back and renders the HTML into the browser. It's all running client side here. Nothing is executing on the web server at this point in time. It's all running client side. Even if I click on counter, even if it looks like it's posting data back, it's all running in the browser. There are no post backs here to the client. I really hope that makes sense. Right, but for all practical purposes, I'm certainly not planning to go and demo that and use that from the start. We will next level that in a couple of seconds. What I am planning to do is I'm planning to first work with this application here. You'll see it's just I'm Jonathan Doe. I made a couple of typos there. So you can see I'm running this application from my desktop. There's no web server involved here. That is a static web application. So the HTML renders, the HTML has got some JavaScript, and the JavaScript makes calls to web services or to some or other REST API. It could be anything, right, that returns some data. It could be Azure storage accounts with tables or whatever that might be. All right, so any questions around that? Are we all on the same page with regards to what is a static web application? Please, if there are questions, I'll give you a couple of minutes here to see if there are any questions. Questions, comments, or are we good to go? You're going too fast. I'm going to slow you. How's the pace? Okay, so let's take a step back, and now that we understand what the static web application is, let's see what we can actually use to run this inside of Azure. Now, I've got a couple of scenarios here, and I'm going to walk you through all three of them. We will end off with static web apps. This is the new cool kid on the block, if you like. And then I will also just briefly outline some other services that you might also be using to run this. The key here is cost, right? And you will see that if I was running a Kubernetes cluster for 20 static web applications, that is like buying one of Elon Musk's rockets to walk down to the pharmacy. It's a complete overkill, right? You can do it, but just because you can doesn't make it right. Why? Because your static web applications really just needs a location that you can access the content, and the browser will do the rest. So to go and spend lots of money on something like an app service or like a Kubernetes application in Kubernetes that has got that compute capability that's a lot more expensive than something like a storage account is a complete overkill. So you want to steer clear of that. You'll notice that we'll talk about storage accounts, the like cheapest chips type scenario. We will talk about app services, which is quite expensive, but the capability and the management features you get with app services are vast. I mean, I can talk about that for about a day. And then you got your static web apps, which is kind of where things are at the moment, and we will talk about that in a couple of minutes. Okay, so let's start with storage accounts. I'm going to head over here to my browser once again. Yes, hello.
Sorry,
a question.
There's a quick question in the chat from
please.
Muhammad. On your static web app, when you're using HTML, it says, what about security considerations while passing the data from browser itself? I hope that makes sense.
So keep in mind, if the execution was happening on the server, the data would still render in the browser. So there's no real big difference in that sense. Of course, you always have to be mindful of these sort of things, and there's mechanisms to store the data securely on the client side. But whether the data is arriving in the browser in a raw format or in an HTML formatted format, it really doesn't really matter in that context. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit more of an indication of what that is. But the reality is we do have to think a little bit more differently about how to handle the data if the business logic side of things is executing on the client, because now suddenly you've got JavaScript code talking to your REST services, and that might be a complete security risk and a very high risk sort of scenario, right? It's one thing if you're just connecting to the web server. It's another thing exposing your REST-based endpoints to the browser that someone can actually just see, oh, there's a REST call going out to this IP address. It's using that URL, and it's returning the data, maybe even unauthenticated, right? So what you end up doing is you end up ensuring that the data in transit between the browser and the services in the backend, your microservices architecture, you ensure that information is encrypted. So use HTTPS and SSL for encryption there, but also implement some sort of an authentication mechanism. It might be that you're authenticating using a key. It might be that you're authenticating using certificates or something like that. There are a couple of options to ensure that there's end-to-end encryption there, and there's also options to ensure that the data is cached sometimes and even stored securely on the client side. So yeah, that's certainly something to keep your eyes open for. I hope that sort of answered the question at least to a certain extent. Okay, all right, where were we? We were talking about storage accounts. I'm going to create a storage account here quickly. If you're not familiar with storage accounts is a pretty neat feature. Let's just go with static web here for a name. you'll notice that it's bleating about that. I'm just going to go with JStatic. In fact, maybe JStatic, just like that, could work. Yeah, it's a happy puppy. The reason why it was bleating about that, and this is not because I've already had one of these in my subscription. The reason it was bleating about that was there's already another static web storage account somewhere in the world. This is a globally unique name, right? So your storage account is a globally unique name, and I'm going to just plonk it down here in UK South, my new favorite sort of Azure region. I'm going to go with all the basics here. What I am going to do is I'm just going to go with locally redundant storage just to do that. And then I'm going to enable, you will see there, I'm going to enable blob public access. What this allows me to do is it effectively allows me to store content in the storage account and access that content without being authenticated. Right. So I'll probably receive a mail from Microsoft in the next 10 minutes bleating about the fact that I created something that pushes data out in an unauthenticated manner, and they will probably close this down in the next 3 or 4 hours. That they will uncheck this box on my behalf in the background. So I'm not going to go through the rest of these options here. I'm simply going to hit the review and create, and that will go and spin up a storage account. Everything you might expect from storage, secure, encrypted in at rest, the ability to bring your own keys, the ability to use Azure AD authentication, so integrated single sign-on to access the content in here. And on top of that, your storage account is going to give you a whole bunch of different services, right? It will give you blob storage, which is what we're going to be using, but it'll also give you file shares. It'll also give you queue-based storage, like so where you want to do something like load leveling. Maybe you've got 1,000 point-of-sale devices, and those point-of-sale devices are sending your sales order messages to a server. The server needs to scale to handle that load. You can rather send the messages to a queue, and the web server or your server can be reading those messages off in bulk, right? Kind of transactions. There we go. The storage account is complete, and we also have tables, right? So you'll see there are actually these items: containers, file shares, queues, and tables. And tables is really like a NoSQL key value pair type lookup, right? So also a great backend for static web apps, by the way, for getting to the content and just storing some sort of simple information that might not be relational as a backend behind your web application. So before I continue here, I'm going to click on containers, and you'll see that currently there's a log. Let me just bump the font here slightly. I'm going to go for create a new container, and I'm going to call this one web app. You'll notice there that I've got a couple of types of authentication. There's a private option, right? Access level. This means I cannot access this storage container without being authenticated or providing some sort of a credential. I can also do blob anonymous, which means if I know the URL of the blob, then I can get to the blob without authenticating. And then I've also got container anonymous, which implies that I might not know what the URL of the blob is, but I can ask the service to enumerate the blobs for me and get the URL and then call the URLs, right? So we're just going to go with this option here. Because we know what the URL is. Your HTML page doesn't randomize the location of images and stuff like that, right? Your HTML page has got an absolute reference to the CSS file, an absolute reference to the images, right? It knows what those URLs are. So blob anonymous access for blobs only is actually perfect for that. I'm going to hit the create button, and this will actually go and spin up this web app of mine. I'm not going to start with that fancy web app now. I've got about 30 minutes in here. I'm just going to hit the upload button. I'm going to navigate off to my desktop, which is a mess, but there's an index.html file. Maybe I must just quickly crack this thing open so you can take a look at what it does. Right? It's just, the Azure Administrator course that we train. Right, static web app, and it's got a reference, it's got an image there, right? And the image is also on the desktop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to point it to index. I'm going to point it to AZ104 and hit the open button. And from here, click on upload. It would have uploaded these two blobs. There's my blob. And you'll notice that if I go and copy that blob to the clipboard, let me just crack up an in private browser session here. There's the web app, right? So storage accounts give me this capability, and it's a very cheap way to store your static web app. If this was a Blazor assembly web app right now, it will actually run that ASP.NET Blazor application right in the browser. It's just dishing out the content via HTTP or HTTPS, okay? Storage accounts, that's certainly one way of doing it. You will also notice that if I scroll down here, that we've also got this thing called static website, right? So all this is going to do, if I enable it, and I will enable it quickly, and I will specify the default document, hit the save button, and if I go back to my containers now you will see that there is actually a $web there, right? And that's all it really does. It just creates another one of these storage containers for me. A storage container is almost like a cloud volume, if you want to see it like that. There you can see the access level is private, which I want to change actually. So I'm going to change that to, that's the wrong one. I'm going to change that to blob anonymous and hit the OK button. And if I go for that $web now, I can go and upload those images, no problem whatsoever. However, I do want to, is that my Teams that's bleating there? What I do want to do though, is I want to head off to this location. And I want to crack open this folder here with Visual Studio Code. All right, so what I've got here is I've got that application of mine, and we've actually got Azure CLI command that will allow me to target the storage account. You'll see there if I and there's the string that I can execute. I can say AZ storage blob upload batch -s. This is actually the current directory that I'm targeting. In other words, the directory on my local device. And then I can specify, $web, which is the target, storage container that was created. It was called $web. That is what that static web application did. And then I can specify the account name. And of course, at this point in time, the account name is not always on. It's called JStatic. Let me just make sure about that. Yeah, JStatic, that is correct. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to execute this AZ storage blob upload batch command. This is effectively going to upload my current directory with all the HTML content into that location. And you will see directly after that, if I go and navigate to that URL, there's the static website. It would have actually given me a URL here. See there, let me just zoom in here quickly. We'll see there, jstatic z33.web.core.windows.net. And there my static web application is running from the storage account. Nothing is stopping me from taking something like a custom DNS name, strapping the DNS name up to the storage account, and I can be, hosting my static web content from the storage account. No problems. Right, so that's the one option, storage accounts. Okay, we will quickly get back to the slide here. And the next option, as you can see here, is app services, right? So I can use storage accounts, by far the cheapest, by far also the least amount of capability. So be mindful of that. You're not going to get fancy CI/CD capabilities when you're talking about storage accounts. It's really just a cloud volume that's streaming out HTTP or HTTPS-based data, right? So static, no server-side execution even inside here for storage accounts. Be mindful of that. Right, so the next option is app services, right? And app services takes a little bit longer to provision, so I've actually gone and I've provisioned one already. There's one called JStatic. I had a big mess with my cleanup script, and it removed all my stuff yesterday in the demo.
Johan,
Yes.
just a quick question on storage accounts. It
Please.
says, do we have an option to use custom domain names in storage accounts?
You absolutely have, yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
You went quiet there. It's like you don't believe me. But yes, you absolutely. You can hook up a custom domain to a storage account. So what we tend to do when we build web applications that are not static web applications is we take the static content, put the static content in the storage account, and take the dynamic content like your ASP.NET or PHP or Java code, and we put those in web apps, right? And so the web application references your static content by means of, for example, just a path like a static content or a static.contoso.net, something like that. So yeah, you can absolutely bring your own custom domain to storage accounts. That's for sure.
Thank you.
No worries at all. I'm glad there's questions. Otherwise, it feels like I'm monologuing, and I don't often feel like a superhero. That's for sure. So moving straight ahead here, you will see that this is a web application, right? And you'll see that now there's actually some compute happening, right? If I scroll down here, you will see that if I look at my metrics, there you will start seeing some web-related stuff, right? So you can see here that there's the thread count, there's the handle count, there's data in connections. There's all sorts of metrics here for the web application that's got web-based traffic. But you will see things like the number of requests, etc. So this is a fully fledged, fully functional web application. And if I go up to my overview again, and wait for this thing to load, then you will see that it's actually, it was from my demo early on. So I just had to refresh it. It was cached, by the way. So there you can see this is the vanilla sort of web application that runs with if I create a new web application. I'm going to put this in the chat window so some of you can actually hammer the URL a little bit if you're keen on doing that. Okay, so there's the web application. Now I want to make it clear here that, and I usually use this quite effectively. I want you to look at the scroll bar here, right? If you look at the scroll bar, you can see that the scroll bar is around between a third and a quarter of the page. This means that there's a lot of stuff you can do with this app service, right? There's a lot of configuration options. There's authentication here, where I can actually point it to, some or other identity provider, right? I can authenticate with Apple without changing my code at all. I can authenticate with Facebook and Google and stuff like that. There's backup options here. There's your custom domains. There's your SSL settings, right? All sorts of things which really next levels this above the storage account in quite a big way. And I can also scale it up and out. And you'll see that I can even bring in some custom scaling, right? So there you can see I can actually go and add a rule that scales the environment up, increase the count by 1 if the CPU is over 70% for 10 minutes, right? So what you really get with an app service plan, and that's probably why it's so expensive, is you really get a cluster of servers, right, running inside of Azure with a load balancer in front of them. So the minute my application comes under load, we will automatically, using that flexibility and that elasticity of the cloud, we will automatically go and scale out the environment, right? And scale the environment back in based on usage, based on even days of the week, based on public holidays, if you want to do it like that, right? So there's lots of different rules that you can bake in here to scale your application. But if I scroll down, you will see that there's some advanced tools here. There's a whole list of different things, right? It's a massive service. This was actually the second service that we enabled inside of Azure after we enabled virtual machines. So this service really has grown quite a bit over time. By the way, one of the options I've got here is a deployment center. And this is giving me the ability to actually target something like GitHub, Bitbucket, or Azure repos for that matter, if my code is stored there. And if your organization is not invested in some CI/CD type tooling, you don't have to go and invest in that, because the app services will automatically go and target those services, authenticate on your behalf, build your application using the CI/CD pipeline tooling, and deploy your application in here. So whenever there's a change, maybe to the master branch, something like that, we will automatically deploy the new version of your application in here. We've also got what's known as deployment slots. And with deployment slots, you'll notice that it allows me to effectively create a different environment in the app service. So this is typically the production slot. And you'll notice I can go and add a UAT slot. I can go and add a dev, a test slot, all different slots. Now, this allows me to rotate my application through these slots. So once my developers create a new release, my pipeline will automatically deploy my application into the test environment. Once it's tested, we can swap test with UAT. Once we're happy with UAT, we can swap UAT with my production environment. So great capability here, much more expensive because you get all these features. So because this is Azure Compute capability, this is in fact a massive overkill for what you have with static web applications. And there you can see Python, PHP, Ruby, Java, Node, whatever, right? Server-based frameworks that actually want you to execute the code on the server. So in actual fact, to run a static application out of this is a complete overkill, right? Because the static application is just going to stream the raw HTML to your browser. The browser is going to do the bulk of the execution and do the work, and probably connect to something like Azure Functions for the data. So you're paying for the expensive compute here, but you're likely not going to be using that expensive compute. It's really just going to pick up the file and stream it out. You might as well just be using storage accounts. There's actually no difference except the cost is massive here. So how do we get my static web apps deployed in here? And this is, I did a little bit of homework. There's a couple of new features available here. So I'm going to pop back into my HTML code here again. I'm going to just clear this out so you can see the command I'm using here. And I'm going to go for my Stream Deck here where I've got the code. And there you can see I'm using the following command. Oopsie, wrong button. AZ web app up. It's not the movie. Location UK South, the name of the web application. Attribute that says --HTML, and then the operating system type. It does need the operating system type, especially, well, more specifically, if you're not using Windows. I think it'll default to Windows, but if you're not running the Windows application service plan, then you have to specify Linux. It's got obviously different ways to connect with these different services. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to hit the enter button here. It's that is quite strange. All right, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call it my static. And that will actually, maybe that was planned failure in my demo. If it doesn't see that there's already an existing plan like that and a web app like that, it'll actually go and create it, and it'll then take your static HTML code, shove it into a zip file, and deploy the zip file to the web application. So bit of a sort of backhanded sort of failure of my demo there. I do apologize for that. But I did not spend too much time on that, actually. I only discovered this sort of towards the beginning of this week, to be fair. Okay, so this is a single command that will zip up your HTML application and do a zip deployment into an application service plan. If the application service plan already exists, then it will update the application service plan. If it doesn't exist, it will actually go and create the application service plan. So let's take a look at my app services here, and there should be another one. There's one called My Static now. And if I click on the URL, there's my web application. Hello, I'm Jonathan Doe. Right. So now you'll notice I can hit refresh here. You will not see a lot of, you will certainly not see a lot of action here, except for data out, data out, data out. The CPU will not be going completely crazy because it's not executing any ASP.NET or any code. It's literally just lifting up the HTML from the disk and streaming that HTML to the browser. No, nothing happened, no compute required on the server, and that's why I reckon this is actually a bit of an overkill. All right, so that is just to check, be mindful of my time here. That is the second option. We spoke about storage accounts, we spoke about app services. Please let me know if I'm going too fast here. I remember someone saying something about an hour, so I'm not sure if I only have an hour, but I'm going to make it work in anyway. So then I've got this static web apps, right? Now, I want you to be mindful of the fact that with app services, you get application insights, which is, instrumentation for your applications, huge amount of capability. But what if I don't want all that capability? What if I just want a freaking static web application and I need something a little bit fancier than a storage account? Well, look no further than static web apps. And that's, I guess, why everyone is here today, because we've got a specific service for this. I'm going to point it here to my static resource group, and I'm going to call it my static, again, running out of names. You'll notice that we've got a free option. This is actually crazy if you think about this, because you'll notice if I click on compare plans here, take a look here. I can have the free version. There's no cost involved here. The free version, 100 gigabytes worth of bandwidth for your subscription. There's 2 custom domains. So it's a free web application that you can host here, a static web app, of course, with 2 custom domains that I can hook up to it. And you'll see at the bottom, I've got Azure Functions, managed Azure Functions in this environment that I've got for free with no cost. So what this means, and let me just quickly, drop back into the diagram here. What this means for us, if I go back and you can find my mouse, hello. So what this means is if I've got, let's say for argument's sake, I've got my database again, something like SQL. And as opposed to apps and web servers, now I've got Azure Static Applications, right? And there's my browser again, that sort of 3-tiered scenario that we spoke about earlier on, and 2-tiered, however you want to see it. What this means is my browser connects to the Static Web Application Service. The Static Application Service sends the HTML back, right? And now there's HTML that renders on the browser. But now my browser starts making REST calls, right? So the static web application includes the microservices framework, right? So I can actually go and build my Azure functions and host my functions inside the static web application. So there's an extension here, if you want to see it like that, where all my Azure function operations runs, and my browser can now be making calls to these Azure functions, which in turn will connect to my database and actually, stream back the data and then integrate that. So it's not just the web application, but it's also free hosted Azure functions that gives me that microservices architecture on the server side, and obviously some compute as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go with the free option. I'm going to host this in West Europe. It's the closest I've got here, and then you'll see I've got my option. I can point it to GitHub. I can point it to a couple of additional services, but I'm going to essentially point it to Sayeri Mac here, and I'm going to point it to Static Web. Where is it? Static WASM. All right. Static WASM is effectively, and let me just quickly go to my GitHub here. There's my static WASM repository. You'll notice that static WASM was cloned from this. Oh, where am I now? was cloned from this repository, which is a Microsoft repository. And I want you to notice that there's two things in here. There's the API and there's a client, right? So this repository includes the client-side code, right? And in this instance, it's not a static HTML client. It is in actual fact a fully fledged Razor application. So this is a Blazor application that's going to be executing client-side, the .NET code client-side, and it'll connect to the web services in the static web service. So I'm going to point it to that. I'll point it to my main branch, and I will hit review and create here. So what this is going to do, and let me just quickly sort it out like this. I'm going to go into my code just briefly, and I'm going to go trash this specific file. With my changes. You know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to create a new one. Sorry, I might have messed up that one. So let's go with, let me just create a new repo quickly, static web, and let's call this one JStatic for that matter. I'm going to make it a private repository and hit the create button. So what I'm doing is I'm just cloning that Blazor start application. There's my static web app. So if I actually go back in here and click on basic again, then I'm going to go back to GitHub again. Let me just select another one so it refreshes here. And then I should actually have, there's a JStatic option. I'm going to select the main branch, and you'll notice that I can go and select that this is going to be a Blazor application. It's prompting me for the application location. So where's the client-side application? It's contained in the client folder. And where is the API application? In other words, where are the Azure functions? It's contained in the API folder. And the output location is the www root folder. Don't worry too much about the details here. I'm going to hit review and create. And if I hit the create button here, what it'll actually go and do is it'll actually go and create a GitHub action for me. Just refresh this. And there you can see it would have created this GitHub action. If I click on this action, there you will see it would have built out this CI/CD pipeline for me. It will do the build. It will actually target, my client folder. It'll build the client. It will build the API, which is essentially the Azure function that I've got available in there. And it'll output all of the web application to the www root folder. So within a few seconds here, if I just go back to my actions, within a few seconds here, it would have done the build and the deploy of that job. And right now, if I go to the resource, you will see that it still says, hey, this is your static web app, is live and waiting for your content. And in the meantime, it is actually executing, it's doing a build of that static web application with the Azure function and the Blazor code, and it's busy pushing this information back to the static web application. So going back to the static web app, you will see that there is an APIs section here, where you'll see that there's a production option. There will be some APIs that appear in here within a few seconds. I just need to refresh this. I think it's a little bit confused, actually. So there's custom domains. Of course, I can go and add a custom domain. And if I click on APIs, it'll start showing the APIs in a couple of seconds. And there's my environments. It's still waiting for deployment. So just give that a couple of seconds. It should actually not take too long. And what will happen here now is it will take the web application, publish it into the static web app. And if I navigate to that URL, my browser will download the entire Blazor ASP.NET assembly application into my browser, which will render HTML in the browser window. And if I click on that get data item in the menu, it will actually return to the Blazor service in Azure, execute the Azure function, return the data back to the browser again, and render the browser in the client, right? So it's doing almost everything in one simple file sweep here. So it's looks like it's actually finished with that. Let's see if it's done and dusted. Well, I should just be able to press home, right? There we go. It's still busy doing its thing here. So let's just give it another couple of seconds. I'm just going to navigate back to this again because I do think it's a little bit confused, actually.
Johan, while that's running, there was a question in the chat.
Please.
When you were slightly before when you were deploying the app service via VS Code.
Yeah.
The question was, what would be the OS type by default?
The OS type by default will probably be Windows, eh? But I'm speculating here, to be brutally honest with you. I can check because I didn't specify the operating system, right? So I can check for you quickly what that will be. App services, it is my static, and I suspect it'll be Windows. Let's just go for configuration here. Hang on.
Would it be whatever the app service plan is?
Yeah, it'll be whatever the app service plan is. That's exactly what it is. I actually let's just quickly look at properties here. I'm not sure where to actually see to be brutally honest with you. But I suspect I can tell you now that this is a Windows server without a shadow of a doubt. You don't have all these options for a Linux server, so this is probably Windows. Yeah. So the default for that option is a Windows option, but you can also deploy it to a Linux option if you wanted to do that. It's just a parameter as you saw in the code there. So at this point, I hope that answered the question at least. So at this point in time, my GitHub action has completed, it's executed. And if I go back to my static web application now and I click on, if I click on overview and I click on the link, guess what happens is it actually downloads that .NET assembly into the browser, and the .NET assembly knows what to do to inject HTML into the document object model, which makes it look like all the HTML came from the server. It didn't. It's executing right here in my browser. And if I click on fetch data here, you'll see there was a brief delay, and there was a brief delay because if I go back to my static web application and I click on APIs here, you will typically see that under APIs, it's got a get weather service, right? Why is it not showing that? I find that a little bit sort of weird. I'm going to hit the refresh button here. Here we go. I think it's going to appear here now. So there we go. There's my weather forecast service. The static web app is deployed. It can download this static web app code to my browser, and there's a weather forecast Azure function running in the static web app. It's not costing me a cent. I can hook up some custom domain names there, and this Azure function can actually connect out to SQL Server, can connect to Azure Blob Storage, can connect to whatever you wanted to connect to. So it's a great way for you to host your static web applications, modern single-page web apps that only render once on the client and then makes Ajax calls and JavaScript calls to a backend service like this Azure function and returns the data and renders the data in the browser. And if you're using something like Blazor, you don't have to write reams of JavaScript code. You can actually write .NET code and manipulate the interface using .NET code. All right, so I'll see if we can get back to that question in a bit and just tie things down. But there is one or two items I still want to talk about quickly on the slide. I hope that makes sense for everyone. I'm flying through these things here. Feel a little bit guilty about that, but it's also probably fine. So, of course, there are other ways of doing this. Nothing is stopping you ever from bringing your own virtual machine, right? You can bring your own virtual machine. Your virtual machine can have an IP address on the public side, and you can stream your data, do on the virtual machine whatever you like. But you also have some other options. Now, the key here is that the cost involved for these would be sort of $2 and higher. And I'm not talking about $2 for the service. I'm talking about this sort of rough framework that I created here, right? Because all of these options, Azure Container Instances, Azure Kubernetes virtual machines are compute services, right? They have compute capabilities and they can execute code on the server side and return data to the client, right? Your storage accounts and your static web apps are a lot better optimized for the static web app frameworks, right? Whether you are using Angular or whatever you are using, because it doesn't have expensive compute. It's literally going to pick up the content from the disk and stream the content out to the browser. But with static web apps, you also get that integrated function capability. Where's my mouse? Also get that integrated function capability that allows me to even host an Azure function in the static web app. And that provides me with a very effective sort of backend service and a microservices architecture that can actually back my static web application with some backend data. And that is all she's saying. And this is where we ask for questions. Please, if there are any questions, if I haven't answered any of the questions, now is a good time. I'm not at all sure if I've kind of made any sense there. This is the first time I do this presentation, to be brutally honest with you. I've talked about some of these things individually, but it's the first time I stick everything kind of together like that. So please, if there are any questions, I'm happy to see if I can answer some of them.
There's nothing in the chat, Johan. Everything's been already answered by itself.
Oh, really? Okay, sweet.
There is. Did you answer the question about from Raymond? I guess with Azure managed functions, so have quite specific scenarios and use cases.
Yeah, so what you will notice is if I go for static web apps, right, and I create a new static web app, with the free plan, the functions will be hosted inside the static web application. If I go for the standard plan, you will see that I can actually bring my own functions, right? So I might have a separate function application, and I can point the static web app to that Azure function app, right? And it's not completely integrated, and there might be some costs there. So we do provide some flexibility around that. The managed Azure functions means that the static web app hosts your Azure function for you, but you can also bring your own functions if you wanted to do that. But yes, Azure functions, completely different use case. You get things like long-running functions, different types of triggers, input, input and output bindings. It is, it's a whole different topic on its own.
Any more questions? We all good? Does static web app have redundancy options as well?
Well, I'm not 100% sure about that. Not that I'm aware of. But what I can tell you is what it does have is if I go, for example, and let's say that I go and if I click on view all branches here, let's go for the right one. If I go for code here and I click on branches and I create a new branch and I call the branch dev, right? And I go for my dev branch and I make some changes, right? Let's go for example, let's go for client and let's, say that my index is going to have some changes, right? So let's go for hello new world here. And then I'm committing my changes here. So what will actually happen if I go back to the code here and I create a new pull request is very similar to application slots that you've got in application services. See if I merge that, it would actually if I go back to my static web application, let me just get back here, you will see that it will actually in environments here, it will actually go and create a different environment for that dev branch that I created. So very similar to application slots, I can host all my environments in here as well, but I'm not 100% sure about redundancy. That is something I have no idea about. I'll have to go and figure out what that is. I honestly don't know. I don't know what the SLAs are for that, but it's certainly something that we can find out. I'm not sure how the feedback might work here. I can probably feed the information back to you guys, and maybe you can. I don't know if you've got like some sort of communication channel with the community. Let's just try something quickly and head off here and compare the plans. Yeah, I don't see anything related to redundancy here at all. So honestly, I don't know. I'll be speculating.
Cool. Thank you so much, Johan.
All right.
I know it's your first session. You were heavily involved in South Africa in the technical community.
Yeah.
You moved over to the UK, and this, I believe, is your first virtual session in the UK.
It's my first community session in the UK. Never mind virtual. I haven't done anything in person
you
here
do virtual
either.
every day.
So you know, well, no, it's my first community session here. Period. Not just virtual. I haven't done any community work here. It's like a guilt thing that's kind of working up in my head, right? Because you know, I'm quite passionate about sharing knowledge and you know. Seeing lights go on. So I really enjoy that. So hopefully we can have some more of these sessions. If there's any topics that you want me to present, you know, by all means, let me know.
Cool. Are you able to share your LinkedIn profile just in the chat? Maybe if people want to connect.
I can certainly do that. aka.ms/Johan. That's my LinkedIn profile, and you can look up with me there.
Well, thank you so much, mate. I appreciate. You know what? We appreciate everyone coming on. They take out the time. And it's all for free, you know, and no one's paying anyone for this. And they come out just because they have a passion for sharing knowledge. And thank you for those who join as well, because you take out time from your obviously personal precious time to come and join us. And this support means we can set up more sessions and invite more people on. So once again, Johan, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined.
Big pleasure, mate.
And
before we go, I've put Johan's Twitter handle also in the chat, and also put the Bradford Cloud User Group Twitter handle. So any feedback regarding the SLA question or anything like that, if you get back from Johan, what we'll do is we'll post it on the Twitter channel for Bradford Cloud User Group.
That can work.
If you've got Twitter, just follow along and we'll get your answer at some point.
Perfect. That sounds good. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone. Thanks for the questions, and thanks for the opportunity to join your group.